Ni howdy again, it's me and I'm back with part 2 in painting the Death Korps of Krieg. This time I'll be showing you my process on painting tanks. Again, like the infantry, I'm going to be balancing quality with time, so these aren't going to be Golden Demon winners, but they're going to be a few steps above the normal infantry.
This army has about 50 vehicles, so I really needed to break down the painting to get everything done in a reasonable amount of time. So all of the heavy and super heavy tanks will get the full treatment, and the smaller, less important tanks will get an expedited version of the paint chipping, which is the step that takes the longest amount of time.
First up, I'm base coating the model in dark gray. I use German gray for this, and there's going to be another neckbeard that calls me a Nazi again. One time I painted my tanks in German tri-camo and got called a Nazi online. Homeboy had to get into a starship and do a warp jump to stretch that far. Anyways, I'm spraying this color all over the model. I didn't want the color to end up being too dark like my Solar Auxilia, so I'm covering the entire model in this color and not worrying about leaving any black in the shadows. Then I'm highlighting the armor in a medium gray blue. I'm using a technique called color modulation, which is known as unrealistic or hyper-realistic when used in video games. The point of this technique is to accentuate the points of the model rather than just putting the highlight where the sun would be, because that would look boring because it just comes from the top. So I start at the front of the model and use the airbrush to fade the highlight backwards onto the base color. So at every angle, you want to get a hard edge for the transition to maximize this effect. For the hard to paint areas, I'm using the Patch After the Sensei Swag masking tool to get that perfectly straight line. For the sides of the model, I like the light to be coming in from the bottom to really sell the weathering and add as much contrast as possible. So to really sell this effect, you'll need at least 3 colors, but I use 4 or 5 for paint jobs at a higher level. For these models, I only have time for 1 more, so I'm going to use a very light blue-gray, almost like a baby blue. And again, you can do this with any color you choose. I'm doing the same thing as before, but I'm really only focusing on that hard edge. Again, I'm using our masking tool to get the crisp lines. If you don't trust yourself holding the tool straight, you could just use masking tape. And also, if you want one of these amazing tools for yourself, just ask me at a Warhammer tournament if you see me. To give the model even more interest, I'm highlighting certain details like the hatches and the rivets with this brightest color just to really break up the model and show off some of the smaller details. So I had most of the vehicles airbrushed before I started filming this tutorial. So here's a Banehammer, so you can really see the color modulation effect on a larger model. As you can see, I've also highlighted some of the hatches and interesting bits on the model. So a little bit of work on this step really breaks up the monotone gray, especially on the larger boys. So next, I'm going to move on to painting the white recognition markings on the sides of the tanks. This step in the decals really makes the tanks look cool and not just like a block of gray. To do this, I put a piece of masking tape where I want the line to be, and then I mask off the sides of it. Then I put a larger piece of blue tape to catch the overspray. I plan on having my tanks look decently weathered, so this white needs to be distressed. You could chip it normally, but I'm going to choose to spray on chipping medium, and there's really dozens of brands that make this and they're really all the same. You could also use hairspray if you want, or also even salt. If you don't like the randomness of this chipping effect, you could also sponge on some masking fluid, but I like the random chipping, and the chipping medium works great for that. I waited 15 minutes or so for the chipping medium to dry, and then I airbrushed on white. Make sure the chipping medium is dry to the touch when you do this, or the paint will crack. About 15 minutes later, and it's time to really see the magic. I use hot water and a large brush to remove some of the white paint and reveal the gray underneath. Focus scrubbing this brush onto the hard edges or anywhere else you think paint chips would normally appear. Alright, time for decals. Choose really whatever you think looks good, or you can consult the Siege of Rax books. Again, if you need a decal tutorial, check out 2 videos ago on my video painting the Imperial Knights. A lot of people skip decals because they're afraid that the decal silvering will make it look like stickers and ruin their paint job, but I actually think decaling is one of the most important skills you can learn. Decals really add a lot to the model for very little work. So I forgot to do a step before, but I'm going to do it this step. It actually ended up working okay, but I'm using a blue-gray enamel filter to tie all of the colors of the armor together. So after airbrushing the color modulation, you'll notice that there's really a quite stark contrast between the 3 colors of gray, and this effect will just tone it down and make it all blend together. So I'm using about 80% thinner and 20% paint and spraying it on in super thin coats. Just wait for one to dry and see how much the gray has blended. And this actually ended up looking okay on the white stripes and the decals too. Next up is weathering, but first we need to put down a coat to protect the paintwork we've already done. And this will help facilitate the oil painting that we're going to do in the next step. So I took everything outside and gave all the paints a thick coat of varnish. I can't remember the exact one which I used, but a satin or a matte will work. You don't want to go too flat since the oil paint will just absorb into it, and you don't want it too glossy either since the paint will slide around too much and just get wiped off. Okay, so give the spray paint some time to dry, and then it is oil weathering. So I didn't want to darken these tanks down too much, so instead of using streaking grime on the entire thing, which will darken it down considerably, I'm going to choose to selectively pin wash the oil paint into the panel lines and around the rivets and the other details. I'm using brown oil paint thinned down of Gamsol since it's the least toxic for oils and enamels. You'll have to play around a little bit with the consistency of the paint, and each brand will need a different amount of thinner. I would recommend you avoid using the cheap oil paints since they have a lot of linseed oil, which makes thinning hard, and then they tend to separate when drying. So I'm using Winsor & Newton paints, but Abteilung is also a good brand. If you go to the art store, just get the most expensive one you can find. A $20 tube should last the average person a lifetime if they're not painting hundreds of tanks a year. I think I only go through maybe 1 tube a year. So if you did the varnishing correctly, you should be able to just dab this thin down paint into a corner and it'll just flow around, give you some nice shading. Same for on the rivets. The oil paint needs a few hours to dry, so it's time to go outside like a normal human being. I went for a quick run in the woods. Actually, I was walking for most of it since I'm a fat ass, but I did get 4 miles in. I'm trying to train for my other hobby, which is hiking in sketchy places. I'll have Thaddeus put some clips in some of my other hikes. I recommend all of you nerds go outside and get some exercise. This will help with your mental health, which actually makes painting a little bit better. I'm doing a 2-week road trip to Canada in a few weeks, so I'm trying to get my ass up and be a little bit more active. Okay, shot time and back to painting. Like in the last video, I'm using makeup sponges to remove the excess oil paint and clean it up. You could do this while the oil paint is wet, but if you wait for it to dry a little bit, the process is much quicker. I also drag the sponge downwards to get some rivet streaking effects. For areas you can't get with the sponge, a Q-tip is great. And just like on the infantry, you can soak the Q-tip or the sponge in Gamsol to get those oils out that are really stuck on the model. Time for some more weathering. I actually recommend you do this step before the oil weathering and maybe even before the filter, but it worked out better time-wise for me to do this now, and it doesn't really make that much of a difference. I'm taking the sponge with the highlight color to simulate some paint chips on the armor. The lighter color represents like a fresh, small paint chip that just really removes the dirt and the grime and reveals the fresher paint underneath. This color also works as a highlight to make the older rusted chips look more 3D, but more on that in the next step. For this color, I'm just dabbing a sponge onto a paper towel until most of the paint is gone and I'm left with a random pattern that is applied on the vehicle, focusing mostly on the edges or anywhere else where the paint would get hit by shrapnel or rocks that are thrown up by the treads. Alright, this next step is really going to make the weathering look convincing. Unfortunately, it does take a really long time to do, so I'm going to break it down into two different styles. The large tanks will get the VIP treatment, and the peasant small tanks are just going to be done quick and easy. I'll start off with a small one first, since this technique is the exact same as the other step. I'm using a black brown, this time applying this color on top of anywhere where the last color, and trying to leave it around the edges of the black brown. This doesn't need to be exact, but if you're close enough, the effect will look good from about a foot away. On the tanks that actually matter, like the big boys, I'm going to do
swag
chipping, where all of the older rusty chips are painted by hand. This takes some practice to do quickly, and the first time I did this on a Baneblade, it took me about 4 hours. I think each one of these in this army took about half an hour, but since they're not competition pieces, I wasn't exact as I could have been. I use a pretty small brush for this, and you just kind of poke the brown color in and try to make the chip look rough and uneven. You don't want to make a dot or a circle or any other geometric shapes, and on some chips I kind of combine them into a line to simulate a paint scratch. Now moving on to painting the metal bits. You could actually do this before the oil weathering and also oil weather them to save some time, but I did want the metals to stand out a little bit with different weathering. Kind of like the crew maintains the guns, but they can't always touch up the paint. I'm using gunmetal and painting the small arms and any interesting looking pipe bits. Next, I pick out all the Aquillas in gold with some of the details like the power shrine on the back of the super heavies. Pick a gold that has good coverage like Retributor gold so that this step doesn't take forever. I also edge highlighted the gold with chrome before moving on to the wash, but I forgot to show it here. Now time to shade the metallics. For the black, I use Nuln Oil Gloss to make the metals shiny and look somewhat maintained compared to the rest of the vehicle. I also edge highlighted this with chrome after the wash and forgot to film that part too. You could just dry brush the silver after the wash to save some time. For the gold, I just shade it with Reikland Fleshly Gloss. And home stretch after this, everything else is super easy. Then we're going to move on to the tracks.
Bro, you're just shooting it directly at the other chimeras, you know? They're in the danger zone.
Painting this color really makes the tanks look finished. I'm using black to get the maximum contrast with the weathering powders, but you can also use a dark brown or dark metal also. You could spend hours painting this on with a brush, but I've opted to again use an airbrush and the trusty Sensei Swag patented masking tool to help prevent the overspray. Like before, if you don't trust yourself, you could also use masking tape, which will still probably be faster than hand painting and definitely look smoother, but masking tape costs a lot of money now, so the masking tool is the best since it is reusable. Then to make the tracks really stand out, I'm going to dry brush them with silver. This is probably the most satisfying step since it's the lowest effort and the highest reward. It took about 10 minutes to paint the tracks and everything, and then you're good to go from here if you don't want any environmental effects. Pigment time. So I moved my paint station on the floor to make the cleanup process much easier. To start the process, dump the pigment out and then use the bayonet from a Mosin Nagant to check the quality. Just kidding, please don't do this. Then, same as on the infantry before, I'm using a makeup brush to dab on the pigments to the tracks and lower sides of the vehicle. I start with the lighter color, like on the bases. I'm going about 1/3 of the lighter color and 2/3 on the darker color. You can get a little bit onto the tops of the vehicle where the infantry walk around and stuff, but don't do too much, otherwise the tank won't look very good. Also make sure you don't get pigments into your drink. For the next step, I'm using the darker pigment color, and this one is getting about twice as much as the other one. Same as before, I'm just dabbing it onto the model randomly. You don't really need to worry too much if there's too much dark or too much light pigment in a specific area of the model, since we are going to blend it all together in the next step. And I ended up using about a whole bottle of the darker pigment between the infantry and this batch of tanks. Now, same as on the bases and on the infantry, we aggressively blend everything together. Most of the pigments will fall off, but what doesn't will be blended nicely on the model and gather in the recesses. On the larger tanks, I switched to a larger brush to make the blending a little bit better with no visible brush strokes. So this brush is just a powder makeup brush. Definitely get one, it'll help. Then we'll have to seal all the pigments later, and a lot of the pigment will be lost in the sealing process, so put down a little bit more than you think you need. If you make the pigments look perfect before sealing, this effect will pretty much not be noticeable, as a lot of it gets soaked into the sealant and doesn't show up. And actually this is this is why a lot of people don't seal their pigments, but since these are gaming models, I don't want the pigments to fall off over time and make a mess everywhere I go. And the last step is to use Gamsol to seal everything down. I missed the whole model to pretty much to the point where it's soaking because I want everything locked in. And make sure to get the sides of the tanks as well. And that's it, done and dusted. Grab a drink and admire all of your hard work. I wish I could stop here, but I do have another 10 hours of work before this army is finished, since I have to do the photography, filming, the B-roll, and writing the script for this video, and then recording it. And it actually takes about an hour and a half just to set up the army for the big army photo, and then I have to tear that all down and spend a couple hours shooting the individual units. Shooting the action scenes is actually pretty fun, and here's a behind the scenes of how one of the shots was done. Maybe I'll do a video in the future and help you guys get these kind of shots too.
Actually, one more thing to do. It's time to introduce the Death Corps to their new home. Alright, thank you everyone for watching, and I'll be back with another video soon. I think the next one might have some Titans. Okay, bye. Wait, one last thing. I always forget to plug it, but check out the links below for our socials. Facebook and Instagram, you can see what we're currently working on and the behind the scenes of some of the cool projects that we have. Okay, bye for real.